Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Infrastructure Task Force meeting today that is going to be featuring
Yep, I'm good.
Therese McMillan and her team. Um, and so wanted to just thank you all for making the time to be with us today. We're going to be talking about the important topic of housing and equity. Just a few words. We just ask that everyone who's not speaking stay muted. We might mute you for you if you we might use our powers of Zoom as co-hosts to do that. If we hear some things, I know that there's always multiple things going on. We have gotten through the lunch service here at my home school that I'm running, but I wanted to just get us started. I did want to just before we start, so we are talking about housing and equity today, and before we dive into the presentation, I did want to mention an important topic that EBLC has really leaned in on. And I know that our partners at Innovation Tri-Valley Leadership Group and East Bay EDA have been interested in this topic as well. And that's the employer mandate, the telecommuting mandate that's been contained, that was got a lot of attention recently, and we've done some advocacy on it. But I do want to just, Jim Spearing made some, kind of opening remarks at last Friday's commission hearing, to just wanted to let people know that, MTC has received a lot of feedback, and particularly from some of the most significant, important, wonderful, I'll just be very self-aggrandizing, from business groups from around the Bay, about the impact of that telecommuting strategy. That's not our topic today. And so there's a group of representatives working closely with MTC on an alternative that will still achieve the same GHG reduction goals, but they're moving toward a cafeteria style approach. And so their hope is to bring that to the commission meeting on November 20th. So I just want to, for those of you who are here and maybe wanted to have questions and ask Director McMillan about those issues, we're going to just ask you to set those aside. And that's so a week from Friday on November 20th, they expect that alternative to be proposed. But again, a cafeteria style approach that would provide employers some more flexibility in how to reach those GHG reduction goals. But again, it was in consultation with business orgs and with transit operators who are dependent on office commuters. So I just wanted to say that. But so without further ado, what our format today is, we're going to eventually get to a moderated discussion. But first, we're going to have I consider her our very own, but Julie Pierce, longtime elected official, former mayor multiple times over, and council member, and for the first time not on a ballot in a very long time this fall. So she gets to write a new chapter, but has certainly really made such a difference on these important issues as former president of ABAG. And I always learn a lot when I spend time with Julie Pierce. So Julie has been kind enough to volunteer to introduce Therese, and Therese, along with a colleague, Daniel Saver, is going to give a presentation, and then we're going to open it up. I'm going to moderate a Q&A. And so I'm going to ask that you use your raise your hand function to get my attention. And so I can call on you. You can also, put something in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. But I know an hour will go by very quickly. So I appreciate everyone staying muted if you're not speaking, and sharing the space so that we can have a really robust discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on over to Julie Pierce.
Thank you, Kristen. It is certainly an honor to be able to introduce Therese. I took another glance. It's been a couple of years since we hired her, and I took another glance at her resume, and I'm not going to go through it all because otherwise we'd have no time to hear. So I just want to say thank you, Therese, for taking time off from your well-deserved break to join us today. A couple of credentials. She got her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Policy Analysis and Planning at UC Davis, and then went on to get 2 master's degrees at UC Berkeley in city and regional planning and in civil engineering science. So she's an engineer, she's a planner, she's got it all. And so, she's been with MTC the first time for 25 years, then the feds stole her away to Washington, D.C., which actually may look like an easier job now that she's been back at MTC and ABAG. And then she went to LA Metro. and was very active there and helped them get their perpetual sales tax passed, which is something we're all very envious of. Their Measure M sales tax measure, which works forever, something we have yet to be able to achieve, but we're still working on that. Anyway, she came back. We hired her back a couple of years ago to come back to MTC as our executive director when Steve retired, and she is also the executive director for ABAG. And we have now a coalesced staff. They are one merged staff serving both separate agencies. And so she's juggling all the balls and try to keep it all up in the air and doing sustainable community strategy and Plan Bay Area 2050 and trying to reduce greenhouse gases by 19%. And RENA and equity and you name it, she's got all that to do. And oh, by the way, we're in COVID. So Therese, hats off to you. Great job. Keep it up. Hang in there. We don't always agree, but we always have lively discussions. So Therese, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie, so much for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. As was mentioned, I'm actually speaking to you from outside of Seattle on Vashon Island, and just realizing that so much of what, of course, we're dealing with in the San Francisco Bay Area, those issues are shared in many, many arenas, and the Southwest is no different in terms of tackling many of the things that we'll be talking to today. So that's interesting. My colleague, Daniel Saber, is here to help make this presentation. Daniel heads up our housing program at MTC and ABAG, and we're thrilled to have him as part of our team. And so why don't we get to it? Let's bring up the slide presentation, and we can get rocking and rolling. Topic of the day, housing and equity in the Bay Area. And I would like to say that I particularly appreciated the equity lens that was applied for the presentation today, because one of the things that is indisputable is whether you're talking about transportation, housing, land use, impacts on our climate and the environment from climate change and global warming. There are those of us in our larger community that are impacted far more deeply, far more negatively than others. And if we are going to move forward and make progress and improve our way of life, our relationships as humanity, and a number of other things, we need to ensure that we do not leave anyone behind. And in housing, and particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, the gaps between those who are able to live and prosper here and those who struggle to do so are growing. And it's something that we need to collectively own and respond to. And again, I'm incredibly impressed and grateful that EBLC and Innovation Tri-Valley and East Bay EDA all recognize this by manner of inviting us to speak to this topic. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to go over 4 major points. We want to start with the arc of MTC and ABAG's recent housing efforts. The housing portfolio definitely has grown over, the last 10 years in particular, and wanted to just give you a sense of where we've come from and how that defines where we're going. We want to spend some time outlining the three-piece framework. I think you will have all heard about protection and preservation and production and how that is really working to give us the guideposts of where we need to go. Then talk about actually what we're doing at MTC and ABAG in the housing realm. There's been a lot that's happened, and I can say that since I've been on board now, just shy of 2 years. It's been a huge focus because it continues to be in surveys of our, of our Bay Area community, the top issue still. And it's something that, demands everything that we can bring to the table. Finally, we'll focus on planning for equity and how that pivots to our implementation of housing efforts. So let's go. Let's go to the next slide. So we have here the arc of MTC and ABAG's housing efforts. And the large majority of this happened after I had left. As Julie said, I had been at MTC for 25 years, left in 2009. And even in that span, MTC working with ABAG had led efforts like the Transportation for Livable Communities. We were focused on transit-oriented development. We have always strived to balance the beauty and preservation of our landscapes with the need for housing and the growing economy attached to the Bay Area. But it was Plan Bay Area 2040, where all of those dynamics and more really coalesced. And one of the major things coming out of that plan, which was the second plan that was prepared under the new state regulatory structure of SB 375, was the fact that we were falling rapidly behind the level of housing and the span of the types of housing and the affordability of housing that was needed to meet all of those who wanted to live and work in the Bay Area. Coming out of that effort and a very specific targeted focus on housing as the #1 priority was CASA, the Community for Housing in the Bay Area. And again, this was an initiative that happened when I was actually in DC. And CASA was a unique consultancy almost of business interest, development interest, local government interests, and equity social justice interest in the arena of housing. And whether you agreed with CASA and advanced its principles or took issue with elements of it, it indisputably laid a path forward that we'll speak to later on, that we had a collective responsibility to deal with the housing shortages and the lack of affordability that we were seeing in the Bay Area. And very importantly, that no one body was responsible for putting it forward. Regional government couldn't do it alone. The state can't do it alone. Local government couldn't bear the burden alone. That there needed to be a joining of governmental layers as well as a partnership with the private sector that was going to have to lead us to some solutions, even though those solutions were still very much at play. That led us to Plan Bay Area 2050. And that is an incredibly important effort that we are in right now, where, again, back to my opening remarks of this intersectionality of transportation and the economy and housing and the environment, all were gelling together. And a lot of the feedback, not only through the CASA project, but very importantly, how that was carried forward into the legislative arena, which was brought forth a very important piece of legislation, Assembly Bill 1487, which took many of the insights and recommendations, and importantly, important feedback from local government as to how we should begin to advance a different structure for approaching the housing problem and reaching its solutions. Among other things, it established the Bay Area Housing Financing Authority, or BAFA, which is a mantle now that the MTC has, but very, very importantly, there is a joint decision-making element with ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, whereby local government interests and regional government contributions need to work in tandem toward building a base to bring much needed resources to this problem. On top of that, wasn't enough. We have the sixth cycle of RENA, the 8-year planning and housing, regional housing needs determination process, led by the HCD, Housing and Community Development at the state of California. And with RENA, the important recognition, and this was across the state of California, not unique to the Bay Area, was that the state itself was recognizing how woefully behind we were in providing housing. And we received housing needs number of north of 441,000 units that needed to be developed or planned for over the next 8 years. And we are working very closely with local government right now on that process, and Daniel and his team are leading that effort. Big arc. Let's go to the next slide. The one thing, though, that has come out as our North Star, if you will, from everything along that arc is the Threepiece Framework: protection, preservation, and production. That if we are going to tackle these multidimensional housing challenges in the Bay Area, we have to do it on three separate but distinctly connected fronts. Protection, which is a focus on particularly for those tenants who are the most vulnerable toward displacement and the increase, well, certainly, with COVID, a lot of things are sort of changing now, but certainly pre-COVID, we saw just escalating rental units. I believe at one point, San Francisco had the highest, rents in the entire country. Protecting tenants from displacement in order to stabilize their families and communities was one of the key 3 Ps. The second was preservation. We have existing housing that is affordable to lower and moderate income residents, but pressures of gentrification and displacement from, again, the growing economic pressures and opportunities within the San Francisco Bay Area was chewing away at those, the affordability of those units, and preservation of those to the extent we can became also a very important recognition coming out of housing along that arc, a housing policy along that arc. Production, producing new homes at all income levels to increase overall supply was clearly something that was a major recognition. The RENA numbers alone will tell you that we're behind. We're behind on what people need and what people are demanding to be built. And we need, again, to come together to address those, and particularly for the housing stock affordable to lower and moderate income residents. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to my colleague, Daniel Saber, to take this narrative and walk you through how we are working collectively with many of you to address these 3 Ps and how important it is to our future success. So Daniel, I will give it to you.
Thank you very much, Therese. we can go ahead and move to the next slide when you get a chance. So the next part here talks about the three-piece framework that Therese outlined, and clarifies a little bit how the three-piece framework can help us take an equity lens as we approach housing at the regional level. So there's at least two threads through which we kind of want to navigate equity using the three-piece. So the first is the fact that the three-piece framework itself, as a multi-pronged approach, is an equity-based approach. And so specifically, it's recognizing the acute, immediate needs of communities kind of most vulnerable to fluctuations in the market, while also building towards longer-term changes in our housing system. And so really, this is elevating protection and preservation to be on kind of equal footing with production, which historically in the conversation around housing has not been the case. So that was, I think, one of the major signature moves that was made through the CASA process, is really trying to keep all three Ps on the table at the same time. The idea is essentially that we need all three of these working at the same time in order to really make a dent, that there is no one single approach, there's no silver bullet, and that in order to really move the needle, we got to get all three of these right. The second thread is that we can also use each P as a way of focusing on equity, and they kind of have unique components, I would say, of equity that run through each. So just to touch on those briefly, excuse me. So in the protection bucket, the way that equity can help kind of illuminate this for us is that actually a disproportionate number of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color tend to be renters compared to other racial and ethnic groups. And at least one of the factors involved in that is the legacy of redlining, other types of discriminatory practices that actually explicitly excluded these groups of folks from home ownership for decades. Additionally, renters kind of as a class tend to be lower income than homeowners for a lot of reasons that I think would be obvious to everyone here. So with both of those facts in mind, protecting tenants is both a racial justice strategy and it's also an economic justice strategy, trying to focus our efforts in the place where people are most in need. In the preservation bucket, as Therese mentioned, one of the kind of most salient characteristics of the displacement crisis that we've seen in the Bay Area is not just kind of, oh, an eviction happening here or a rent increase happening there, but actually entire buildings full of tenants that are flipped over in one go. So buildings that are currently, or that at least historically have been affordable to lower or moderate income renters, suddenly being sold and immediately rents being jacked up, or a lot of evictions being issued right off the bat. Those properties tend to be located more frequently in communities of color. And in part, that again is kind of a history or a product of our history in the Bay Area, which relates to disinvestment in particular communities, urban renewal, and transit access. So for a long time, it wasn't seen as a good thing to live near the BART station. That wasn't considered desirable, and there was disinvestment in those communities, which drove down property values and allowed lower income people to live there. But now that that's become a hot real estate commodity, those same communities that really had no other place to live but in those areas now are being forced out frequently against their will. And so really trying to focus preservation efforts, which would take those units that are currently affordable to lower income people and try to preserve them as such into the future. So it both prevents displacement of the current residents, and it also preserves the actual housing stock affordable to lower income people. And then finally, on the production side, it's critical, as Therese said, to really produce housing at all income levels, and that's something at the region we recognize and stand behind. At the same time, it's the case that there are certain types of housing that will not be produced by the market alone, simply because they're not as profitable as other types of housing development. And that is housing, particularly for lower income folks. So we need to focus some of our public investment into this necessary, essentially social infrastructure, like public transportation, et cetera. If we think of affordable housing in that way, it requires public investment. So each of these three Ps we can look at each of them to help identify how we should be prioritizing our policy making as well as our resource allocation with an equity lens in mind. So we can move to the next slide. And so, as Therese said, this gets a little bit into what are we actually doing at MTC and ABAG. So we'll turn for a moment from the analytic framework of the 3 Ps and drill down a little bit more into our programs and initiatives that relate to housing. And so, as Therese mentioned, during the last several years, the agency's footprint in the housing sector has really grown, and it's poised to grow even more in the years that come. And so just to quickly illustrate this point, I'm going to talk about 3 initiatives, and Therese has kind of already teed us up for a number of these. So the first is Plan Bay Area 2050, which is the current long-range planning process that we are in right now. And a new approach in Plan Bay Area 2050 with respect to housing that we haven't seen in prior plans is that, as I was just discussing, affordable housing is really treated as public infrastructure. And so there are investments and strategies that are included in Plan Bay Area 2050 that are designed to help us produce and preserve all of the housing needed for our lower income residents in the entire Bay Area by 2050. So instead of saying, oh, how do we just kind of move the ball a little bit forward, the idea is really how do we actually resolve the underlying issue in the long term. And through some of the analysis that has been done on these strategies and investments in the plan, we see that the plan would actually move the needle in a significant way on affordability and displacement, actually resulting in, if these strategies and investments do move forward as outlined in the plan, we would actually improve affordability significantly. And the numbers are particularly strong for folks on the lower end of the income spectrum. So that's a kind of, I don't want to say it's a legacy program, but that's kind of a core program of ABAG and MTC and has been for quite some time. The next 2 are new initiatives that have been launched just recently. So the first one is the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, which, as Therese described, was created by AB 1487. It's really an outgrowth from the CASA process. And it is the first regional housing finance authority in the state of California. We're still checking about whether it's actually the first regional housing finance authority in the nation. We haven't been able to confirm that yet, but if we're not the first, it's certainly one of the very few that exist. And one of the most important characteristics of BAFA is that it has authority to raise significant new revenue for affordable housing in the Bay Area. So that could be done, for example, through a 9-county regional ballot measure. There's now statutory authority for BAFA to do that. Moving on to the next one really quick. So the last item you see here on the right is a regional housing technical assistance program, which we are in the process of launching on the ABAG side of the house with a one-time $24 million allocation from the state budget. This is, I think Julie would tell you, we don't oftentimes see mandates from the state related to housing planning that are accompanied by resources. And last year, pre-COVID, the legislature did not just create new regulations related to housing at the local level, but also actually put a bunch of money into helping local jurisdictions plan for housing into the future. And so ABAG received a portion of these state funds set aside for local housing planning in order to try to have a greater regional impact. And so ABAG will be focusing this program on supporting local jurisdictions to adopt compliant housing elements to implement the RENA cycle that Therese mentioned, and that's giving a lot of local elected officials and local staff quite a bit of heartburn given the dramatically increased numbers that we received from the state. So these are our 3 significant programs at the regional level that are really elevating the work that we're trying to do on housing, as Therese said, in deep partnership with our local governments, knowing that a lot of the frontline action for housing in the Bay Area is happening in local governments. And so at the regional level, we need to be hand in hand with our local partners to move things forward. So we can go to the next slide. And this is the second to last one, so we'll get to questions and discussion here very soon. So let's try and tie together a little bit of what we've discussed. So there's the Threepiece Framework, there's these new programs. When Therese said that we're thinking of the Threepiece Framework as our North Star, part of what we mean by that is infusing it in all of our various housing-related initiatives and programs. So just by way of example, for Plan Bay Area 2050, we see the 3 Ps show up as enhanced housing strategies and funding across all of the 3 Ps. So if you look at Plan Bay Area, there are strategies that are kind of broken out as production-related, preservation-related, or protection-related. And there's concomitant investments in each of those categories. For the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, this authority was created by state legislation, and in that legislation is a mandate to address all 3 Ps. So for example, if there is a regional revenue measure that moves forward at some point in the future, there's statutory minimums for how much money must go to each of the 3 Ps. So at least 52% for production, 15% for preservation, and at least 5% for protections. So that's woven into the very fabric of the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And finally, for the new Regional Housing Technical Assistance Program, we will be supporting local jurisdictions implementing all of the 3 Ps. And so this includes policy development as well as planning. As I mentioned, we're focusing on helping local jurisdictions adopt compliant housing elements. These are kind of housing blueprints at the local level, for those of you who aren't familiar with them. They really are policy and planning documents that lay forth a vision for how any given community is going to accommodate housing for all of its residents and set up programs and policies to achieve the outcomes that are desired. And so those housing elements themselves can contain policies and programs related to all 3 Ps, and we plan to provide technical assistance across the board there. So we can move to the very last slide. And this one for me is exciting. This is again talking a little bit about how things have changed recently. And so on the left-hand side, you can see how some of our traditional planning activities have shifted because of new equity considerations specifically. So in these 2 kind of marquee regional planning activities, Plan Bay Area and RHNA, we have in both of those seen a shift towards a focus on trying to encourage development and growth in high resource areas. So in RHNA, this is really brought about because of a new state statute to affirmatively further fair housing. So for those of you not in the business, this is known as the AFFH rule. There was a federal, or there still is a federal requirement that local jurisdictions that receive federal funding certify that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing. During the Obama administration, there was a new regulation that was passed that was actually just recently revoked under the Trump administration. When Trump was elected, the state legislature here in California enacted that Obama era rule into law in the state. So even though the federal rule has been revoked, it is still the law of the land in California, and every local jurisdiction in the Bay Area as part of its housing element must now affirmatively further fair housing, and ABAG, in setting up the RHNA process, must also affirmatively further fair housing. That's led our policymakers to create a methodology to allocate the RHNA numbers in a way that really focuses on high resource areas. And the same thing is true in Plan Bay Area. Historically, growth geographies have been determined by locally nominated priority development areas. And that's really put local jurisdictions kind of in the driver's seat of where development and growth would happen. And what we've seen is that there are some places that don't step up to the plate. And because of that, the region has difficulty meeting GHG reduction targets as well as various other equity outcomes. And so the new plan still incorporates these locally nominated areas, but for geographies that haven't chosen to do so, we will be now studying growth in specific transit accessible high resource areas. So on the planning side, that's one of the ways in which equity is being infused into some of our work. What's exciting is that in addition to that planning side of things, we're also now really, for, I don't want to say the first time, but stepping up in a big way that's new into the world of implementation. And so BAFA and the Housing Technical Assistance Program are both key to that implementation component. So local jurisdictions are going to get these big RHNA numbers. They're going to have to then actually implement them through their local housing element. Our Housing Technical Assistance Program is going to actually help locals implement the RHNA. Previously, ABAG has been in the position to hand out the RENA numbers, but didn't have the resources to help jurisdictions comply. This is the first time where really we are able to do that extra step. Similarly, on the BAFA side, this is an opportunity to provide funding to actually hit those numbers. It's one thing to plan for your affordable housing. It's a completely different thing to actually facilitate the construction of that affordable housing. And one of the key ingredients to getting affordable housing built is subsidy, public subsidy. And that's in very short supply throughout the Bay Area. And BAFA is an opportunity for us to bring new resources to bear that can help local jurisdictions actually implement their land use plans and zoning to see that housing get built. So I think it's a very exciting opportunity. Both of these are really early stage projects right now. We've been trying to continue to develop them in partnership with local governments as well as other housing stakeholders. But the opportunity to get into facilitating implementation at a regional level, I think is an exciting new chapter for the regional government, and hopefully it leads to a new chapter for the Bay Area. So that concludes the presentation. I think we can set aside the rest of the time for questions and feedback.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Daniel and Therese. You make a great team in tackling this topic. So I'm just going to, again, ask, I have a couple questions to just kick off the Q&A section, but I just would ask that if you are interested in asking a question, please use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can also put it in the chat. But if you raise your hand, then I will go and unmute you and make sure your question gets asked. So just to, so Daniel, I guess my question probably for you, obviously, Therese, feel free to jump in on this, but I just wanted to follow up on, you were talking about kind of your excitement about resolving some of these underlying issues that have prevented more housing from getting developed. And so, it's great to have some of these new pieces in place. For people who watch programs that I moderate I often ask people if they were all powerful and actually could get what they need. Because it seems to me like if just being skeptical, you still are dealing with 106 cities and 9 counties and people that are locally elected who could have the pitchforks come for them if they're actually making changes to local plans or deal with zoning or do the things that we know need to happen. And so, I will send a copy of Golden Gates to anyone. Notice I have 5 copies on my shelf. I'll send it to any elected official on behalf of EBLC, to anyone who needs to read it and hasn't read it yet. But what do you need in terms of executing on this potential? Because a skeptical person would say, come on, like we've got COVID, we've got people fleeing out of state, fleeing to the exurbs. Everything is so different now. What do you think you need in terms of, and I'd like to do what we can to be supportive and helpful, but what do you think you need in terms of executing on all this? Because a skeptical person might say, you're just rearranging and getting better at planning, and how is that actually going to lead to more housing? So what do you think you need?
That's a great question. So I can put a couple of ideas on the table, but would also be curious to hear from those who are in the group kind of about what you think would actually be needed in your community, because I think the answer may vary depending on location and context. So one key thing that we need is more resources. And I'm talking about actual money and for a variety of things. So one is additional money for planning. Local jurisdictions have very stringent new requirements. And so a lot of those folks with pitchforks who may show up at local city council meetings, I'm sure that they will continue to turn out. But the problem that a local elected official is going to find themselves with in the near term is that there are new state statutory requirements to do housing in a different way. The law has changed since this has been done previously. And so I think when a local jurisdiction wants to do right and wants to follow the law, they are still going to need resources to actually get through all of the administrative barriers to implement. So I think that's one key piece. The other is resources for actual programs. It's going to be really difficult in the current environment for local jurisdictions to have the resources that they need to actually move this stuff forward, given local budgetary impacts of COVID. I think we really need to see a big move from the feds this is
Yeah.
where the federal government really needs to step in. And I think that there's a lot of ideas about how that could happen. Another point that I'll make, and then I'll stop, is I think we really need to talk about housing in a different way in our communities, and we need to have new stakeholders brought to the table who aren't in these conversations traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
So it's different in many communities. So this is not meant to be a blanket statement. I do think that there are some communities where there's 15 folks with pitchforks who show up all the time, but there's thousands of people who don't have time to show up because they're working 2 jobs. They, have 3 children, and so they're not coming to the meetings. But those are still really important stakeholders whose voice just oftentimes isn't actually heard in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think finding a way to really try to make sure that every stakeholder is indeed at the table. And then when we are at that table having conversations, how are we talking about this so that we can try to break through some of the really difficult conversations that will have to ensue. And I don't know what exactly the right kind of way to do that is, but I do think it's important that we talk about it differently.
Yeah. Therese, did you want to add anything to that? I mean, I would assume you would agree that, something big from the feds is really needed in this moment.
Partly, Kristen, it's such an interesting question to ask in the middle of COVID, because just, in the span of what's it now, 8 months,
Mm-hmm.
our entire landscape of what we have to do in the public realm has changed dramatically. And so I think, we're use whatever metaphor, flying the plane while we're building it in some respects is definitely what we're doing right now. And so I would maybe add, just unique to that circumstance, is also this ability to pivot
Mm-hmm.
and to work together to respond to circumstances as they change, and to be far more flexible in terms of how we approach things. And I'll maybe Daniel at some point in the questions can talk about our regional housing portfolio and agenda we've put together, because quite frankly, we thought pre-COVID that we would be going to the ballot in November with a major housing initiative. Right. It was polling well. I mean, it was not, at 80%, but we were in that, really important, 2/3, voting thresholds, and then everything fell apart. And so then it was like, okay, now what do we do to start rethinking how we do these building blocks to get to a place of stabilization, so that now we can get back to moving on all 3 Ps. I mean, the one thing that came out of, the COVID situation was this intense focus on the protection element, because vastly more people suddenly were now vulnerable because they didn't have their jobs, because shelter in place and all of the large, impacts that have happened on the economy. So I guess the one thing I would say is, if there's a silver lining, we're learning that we need to work in partnership, we need to pivot, we need to be flexible, and we need to continually redefine what the challenges are while still not losing sight of moving the needle in a larger way. So it's even harder now, but I think we're, again, learning as we go the dynamics that we need to bring to the table to work together.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I want to just follow up on that. There are those of us that were closely following the CASA process, and there was certainly a lot. I mean, in that, for those people on the phone that weren't familiar or on the call, the idea was there was something. I mean, not everybody loved it. It was this diverse set of stakeholders, and so some people, there's a lot of give and take, and truly, kind of a compromise on a lot of different levels. And those of us, like EBLC, who've been really supportive of particularly the production prong, wanted to, we were told, so we're working on protection and preservation first, and then 2020 was going to be the year of production. And there were some people that are really, and it's nice that there are some changes and there are some things that have happened, but there were a lot of us that were a little bit left wondering, like, really? But again, COVID. So what would you like to see? What are the pieces you'd like to see in place from the state, in terms of some of the unfinished things? And it could be a completely new idea, than anything that's been introduced. Or was there a particular bill or two that you thought was a real missed opportunity coming out of the last legislative session, since we're about to get back up on the horse? You're smiling, Daniel. I know you have something to say. Okay, Therese, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel because, part of what his major, task was being able to do this crosswalking now of, what was on the legislative table and what got left behind, and now what are we picking up and what are we moving forward? So, Daniel, why don't you jump in on responding to Kristen's question?
Yeah, I think a couple of threads are alive here. So one is, the year of production has yet to materialize, as you said. So I think we should anticipate, and I think it would be important to see some moves on the production side. And I think that there's kind of two features of that. So one is funding, which in this current climate is going to be very difficult at the state budget. And I think we're pretty clear-eyed about that. The other side has to do with, other types of reform that we could see at the state level. And I think the key thing that we've heard from our boards is that it's important to try to get some movement there, but to have that be thoughtful movement, and to recognize that one size fits all really doesn't work. And I know that that's a talking point, but it is the case. And so how do we work with our state partners towards some sort of reform related to land use or zoning or fees or whatever it is, that's going to be doable for our local governments? And kind of where's the middle ground that's really going to work? I think that's a key thing that we're likely to see. I would also put on the table, I think, one key question for a lot of folks in the next legislative session is that on the protection side, there was a really critical bill that got through this last year to try to I would say, stave off the eviction cliff, AB 3088. But that bill was a stopgap. That is not a permanent fix. That bill does not deal with the funding issue of what happens for all the unpaid rent that's owed out there. And that bill will expire at the end of January. So the eviction cliff didn't go away, it just moved a little bit. So I think we're all looking to see what's going to happen there. And again, I think that the reality is the type of funding that's going to be necessary to plug that gap can only occur realistically at the federal level. And so I think we need to be thoughtful about how our regional, our local governments can be working with state and federal partners to try to piece together a puzzle that will actually address that issue.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate very much your appreciation of the scale of the problem, and that, I mean, all kinds of folks talk about with the cost of housing being what they are, unless something profound changes. I mean, the amount of money it's going to take to actually build low-income housing at, using just exclusively public dollars is just really, really hard. So we have to be creative and unleash that. And so to that point, actually, I want to put Leo Scott on the spot and go ahead and have Leo ask the question he put in the chat. We've learned that our raise hand function is not enabled on this Zoom. So you can just put in the chat that you have a question, and I'm happy to turn to you with our remaining just couple minutes here. So Leo, take it away.
Well, so I'm going to pitch it back to Daniel here and say, okay, Daniel, so if we're successful in getting all these various groups at the table, how are we facilitating the discussion to get an outcome that changes something? You kind of put it out there, and I'm kind of curious what you guys see as some possible ways to do that.
That's a great question. I'll punt a little bit by saying that there is. So the short answer is, I think the conversation and the way that we set that up should be evidence-based. So I think that one of the things that happens when you get into these contentious conversations is that kind of a lot of people are bringing a lot of preconceived notions to the table, a lot of deeply felt beliefs to the table. And if we get stuck in that world, we just keep butting heads. There is some recent research that's been done on messaging for housing, specifically in the Bay Area. And this includes pollsters as well as other social scientists who are actually looking at how do we talk about housing in a way that motivates people towards positive action, and how do we talk about this in a way that engenders a sense of shared responsibility to move us forward towards shared prosperity. And so there's a number of folks who have been working on this. The Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California has been convening some groups together on this. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative has also been funding some of this research. So I do think that it's all very early stage in the way that it's coming out. As part of our Regional Housing Technical Assistance Program to help local jurisdictions with their housing elements, we do plan to come up with some training modules that actually leverage this new research that's, again, Bay Area based. This isn't national research or even California research. This is Bay Area voters, Bay Area residents, what is moving them on the housing topic. And I don't think this is a panacea, but at least it's something that is rooted in evidence that may help us shift a little bit the way that we talk about this that can contribute towards a positive outcome. So I don't know what the 30-second elevator pitch is of how to do that new spiel, but I know that the evidence is out there and there's some indications about a new direction.
Yeah. In the interest of time, I'm just going to, Chadi Chosbeck put such a great question in just as a follow-up that, right? And a little bit to Leo's point, the general public doesn't understand these state mandates and the laws that drive this change. And so, and yet, and that happened here locally, like, there's candidates running on a real anti-housing platform that get elected. And so what can MTC in partnership with the business community do to explain the concepts and the change that needs to happen? I mean, it's just so fraught. It's so fraught.
Well, I want to jump in with a couple of observations. One is we've done a much better job, I think, of planning for these issues. And again, recognizing these intersectional challenges and impacts. That if we don't get the housing right, we have soul-crushing congestion. If we don't get the affordability right, we have businesses, many that are, on this call, who can't get the workers that they need because, labor markets can't afford to live here. We have people who are having multi-generations, like our children, who are moving back with us after they have gone to school and gotten their degrees and can't afford to live on their own. And that's a lived experience that actually is becoming a data point for a lot of us. Giving voice and a place to be able to recognize those very real felt experiences is incredibly important. And beyond just the planning, I certainly believe, and this is since I've come back, that MTC and ABAG organizations are also working to create a space for a better forum for deliberation, for listening, and decision-making. President Jesse Arreguín has established a new ABAG housing committee to take on and be able to present a very specific space to take on this regional housing portfolio and where we're going to go forward with it. The commission, again, through AB 1487, now has absorbed this new BAHA, Bay Area Housing Authority, role, but recognizes that it needs to work hand in hand with ABAG in terms of developing what a new expenditure plan would look like, what scale of revenue might come to the Bay Area, which means we need to sell it to the voters together. So I feel hopeful that we are also investing in hearing the voices that need to be heard and collectively problem solving to this effort, because it's not going to happen on its own. And it doesn't rest just with one specific entity or level of government. And that's part of what we need to do is create the space in order for the decisions in a different future to be crafted.
Yes, we have lots to do. I mean, I appreciate your thought on that point, and I'm tempted to leave it there, but we do in fact have 3 more minutes that I'm going to take advantage of, Therese. So I'm going to see about imposing on my friend and colleague, Lynn Naylor, to see if she has a point of view or a question that she wants to get in before the end of time. Also, Carlene from EDA. I'm not seeing Stephen on the line, but just wanted to give both of our co-hosting organizations a chance to ask a question or make a comment. So Lynn, do you want to throw anything in there, or perhaps Tim?
Is Tim with us?
He was earlier. I did.
He was
I don't know if
earlier,
he's-
yeah. I just want to say how appreciative ITB is of the discussion about messaging specifically. We think we can have an impact and be really helpful with our colleagues in the region, but we need to get those talking points developed in a way that makes sense, and we need to do it quickly. So really appreciate the feedback. I just see Daniel just sent out some messaging, and we will go to work on that. So thank you for this discussion, and especially that next step. Thanks, Kristen.
Hey, sure. Thank you, Lynn. Carlene, did you have a question or anything you wanted to add?
No, but thank you so much, Therese and Daniel, for your thoughts and suggestions. I mean, coming out of COVID, thinking more strategically on how to, raise these issues in a more thoughtful and strategic way is going to be super important to help us recover and reimagine the East Bay's recovery. I really appreciate your thoughts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carlene. All right, I'm looking at, I wanted to see Brian Wenter, Andrew Saby. Any last question you have? No, for the good of the order. So I do want to just, what could we do short of a sales tax? A regional sales tax in terms of using this authority. Are there any good thoughts you have kind of percolating that we could be thinking with as we leave?
Daniel, do you want to speak to the pilots effort that ABAG is going to be taking up?
Yes. So we, as Therese mentioned, we're not moving forward with a ballot measure. We didn't. The election has just passed. But both ABAG and MTC have decided to join together to launch a new expanded regional housing portfolio. So to try to essentially lay the groundwork so that when we do come into resources, we can deploy them effectively. So we have developed the concept for 5 pilot projects that we are hoping to launch during the coming years. We ourselves are in the midst of a fiscal crisis, so it's not like there's a lot of money sitting around to immediately dive into these. We need to do a little bit of fundraising in order to actually carry these activities forward. I'll just say that the information about the 5 pilots is available if you check the ABAG website, the ABAG Housing Committee from October. That packet has some more information about those. And then we're also planning to release kind of a little bit more publicly a concept paper or a white paper that talks about those in greater detail in the next month or 2. So there should be more information about those. And that's kind of where we're focusing our efforts in the next couple of years as we also try to attract greater resources. Okay,
great. Great way to close that. So we'll definitely check out the October ABAG Housing Committee to get those details. So I do want to respect your time, and we did make this a 1-hour program to end here at 3 o'clock. And so just wanted to thank everybody for making the time. Therese, particularly on vacation, thank you for honoring this, and Daniel for helping to put this together. So I do just want to again thank Innovation Tri-Valley Leadership Group and East Bay EDA for joining the East Bay Leadership Council. Like with all of our Zoom meetings, I wanted to go ahead and let people know that this will be available on our website, and the members, benefit of membership is access to all of our task force meetings, all those recordings. And also, if you haven't done so already and you want to experience a really uplifting morning, our 10th annual Philanthropy Awards is Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. We have 9 outstanding honorees, and you will not want to miss it. So you can attend that for free by going to our website, eastbayleadershipcouncil.com. So with that, I just want to thank you all for making the time and look forward to seeing you soon. And thanks again, Therese and Daniel. Take care.